The gray silk of her Cheong Sam was still dusted white from the road when Leon Joe stepped down from the wagon and saw that the house she had crossed an ocean to reach no longer had a roof. Black timber jutted up from the foundation like broken teeth. The barn beyond it stood half collapsed, one wall folded in on itself, and the smell of old smoke still clung to everything, sharp enough to catch in the back of her throat, even weeks after the fire had gone cold. She had been told she was marrying into a working cattle operation outside Prairie Bend in the Wyoming Territory, a ranch with 400 head and a good well. Nobody had written to tell her the house had burned to the ground 3 weeks before her ship ever left Canton. "You're the bride," said the man standing near what used to be the porch, and it was not a question so much as a statement he seemed to be testing for himself. He was tall, weathered around the eyes in the particular way of a man who had spent every summer of his life under open sky, and he had not shaved in what looked like several days. His shirt was stained through at the collar with soot that had not fully washed out. "Name's Josiah Reed. I reckon your family didn't tell you about the fire." "No," Leanne said. She kept her spine straight, the way her mother had taught her to stand when the ground beneath her had shifted and showing it would only make things worse. "They did not." Figured as much. He looked past her at the wagon driver unloading a single trunk, everything she owned in the world compressed into a box of lacquered wood. "You're welcome to turn around. Driver'll take you back to the rail stop. For a fee I'll cover myself. I won't hold you to an arrangement your family made with a man who had a roof over his head at the time he made it." The offer was decent. Leanne understood that much immediately. Understood, too, that a lesser man in his position, having lost nearly everything to fire, and now facing a stranger sent across an ocean under false pretenses, might have simply told her to leave without offering to pay her way. But she had not spent 6 weeks at sea and 3 days on a train through country she had never seen to turn around at the first sign that the life promised to her did not match the life delivered. "What happened to it?" she asked instead, nodding toward the ruined house. "Lightning caught the hayloft in June. Wind carried it to the house before we could get water on it." Something tightened at the corner of his jaw. "Lost most of the herd trying to keep the fire off the north pasture instead of saving what I could save. Wasn't a smart trade looking back." "You saved your neighbor's land instead of your own house." "Didn't think of it as saving anybody's land. Thought of it as not wanting 300 head of cattle to burn alive while I stood there." He said it flatly, without any apparent awareness that he had just described an act most men would have called brave. "Point is, ma'am, what you were promised isn't what's standing here. I won't pretend otherwise." Leanne looked at the burned frame of the house a moment longer, then at the man in front of her, waiting for her answer with the patient stillness of someone who had already made peace with whichever way it went. "I did not come this far to leave because a house burned down," she said. "Houses can be rebuilt. I would like to see the rest of the ranch before I decide anything." Something shifted behind his eyes, surprise he did not bother to hide. "Suit yourself. Barn's this way, what's left of it." He did not offer his arm. She had not expected him to, but he slowed his pace to match hers across the uneven ground, and that, she thought, told her more about the kind of man Josiah Reed was than anything he could have said outright. The first week passed in a rhythm neither of them had planned for, but both fell into without much discussion. Leanne rose before the sun the way she had been raised to, and found that frontier mornings asked for a different kind of discipline than the counting houses of Canton had ever demanded of her. She learned to draw water from the well before the heat set in, learned the particular sound a hen made when a fox had come sniffing near the coop overnight, learned that Josiah Reed said almost nothing over breakfast, and everything he needed to say through the work he did before most men would have finished their coffee. "You don't have to help with the fencing," he told her the third morning. watching her lift a section of split rail without being asked. Ladies from back east generally don't take to this kind of labor. I am not from back east, Leanne said, setting the rail into place with more strength than her frame suggested she carried. And in my family's house, everyone worked or no one ate. I do not intend to sit inside embroidering while a ranch needs rebuilding around me. He studied her for a long moment, the particular look of a man revising an assumption he had not realized he was carrying. Suit yourself, he said again, the same 2 words he had offered her on the first day, though this time they carried something closer to respect than surprise. By the end of that first week she had mapped the whole of what remained standing, the smokehouse that had survived by some quirk of wind direction, the well house with its cracked but functional pump, the tool shed where Josiah kept a single surviving photograph of the house as it once stood, tucked behind a shelf of nails as though he could not bear to look at it directly, but also could not bring himself to burn it. She did not mention that she had seen it. Some things, she understood, a person needed to be ready to speak of in their own time. The town of Prairie Bend sat 11 miles east, close enough that word of the burned ranch and the arrival of a bride from China had already made its way through every general store and church pew by the time Leanne and Josiah rode in 3 days later for supplies. She felt the stares before she heard the whispers, felt them the way she had felt stares on the docks in San Francisco. A weight settled across her shoulders that she had learned not to flinch beneath. Pay them no mind, Josiah said, low, as they tied the horses outside the mercantile. Half this town's opinion changes with the weather. The other half answers to Nathaniel Corliss, he said, and something in his voice went careful in a way it had not been before. Owns the bank, owns the feed store, and owns the water rights to 2 of the 3 creeks that keep this valley alive. He's been wanting my north grazing land for 3 years. Man like that doesn't need the whole town to like him. Just enough of it scared. They had not made it 10 steps into the mercantile before a man detached himself from the counter to intercept them, silver watch chain catching the light, boots too clean for a man who claimed to work cattle for a living. Josiah, the man said, pleasant as poured honey, though his eyes moved over Leanne with an assessment that made her stand straighter out of pure instinct. Heard your bride finally arrived. Didn't expect she'd come all this way to find a pile of ash waiting for her. Nathaniel. Josiah's voice stayed even, but Leanne noticed his hand had gone still at his side, the specific stillness of a man choosing not to move rather than a man who had nothing to say. Something you need, or are you just here to comment on my misfortune? Just being neighborly. Nathaniel's smile did not reach his eyes. Though I'll say, a man rebuilding from nothing might find the bank more generous than expected, should he decide selling that north section makes more sense than starting over. I'll rebuild on my own land, Josiah said. Same as I've done every other hard year. Every other hard year you had a house standing, Nathaniel said, and turned that same assessing look back toward Leanne one final time before he touched the brim of his hat and walked out into the street. Ma'am. Leanne watched him go and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent her whole life reading the men who controlled the rooms she stood in, that Nathaniel Corliss's politeness was the most dangerous thing about him. He wants that fire to have broken you, she said quietly, once the door had closed behind him. Josiah looked at her, something new in his expression, an acknowledgment she had said aloud a thing he had not said to anyone. Man's been waiting 3 years for a reason to make me an offer I can't refuse. Reckon he thinks the fire did the work for him. Then we should not let it look like it did, Leanne said. Word of the confrontation in the mercantile spread through Prairie Bend faster than either of them expected, and by the time they rode back out to the ranch that evening, 3 separate neighbors had already found reason to stop their wagons along the road and offer quiet words of support, the particular kind of solidarity that frontier people reserved for anyone brave enough to stand against a man most of them feared, but few of them respected. "That's Otis Bramwell's land bordering the north section," Josiah said, nodding toward a modest farmhouse as they passed. "Corliss called in a loan on him 2 winters back over a debt Otis swore was already paid. Never could prove it. Lost 40 acres for it." "Then he is not simply greedy," Leanne said. "He is practiced." "Practiced enough that most folks around here have stopped keeping careful records, on account of thinking a wealthy man's word carries more weight than a poor man's numbers." Something in Josiah's voice carried a weariness that went beyond his own trouble. "You're the first person in 3 years who's looked at his books and called it what it is, instead of assuming it was just bad luck." "Numbers are not opinions," Leanne said simply. "They are either true or they are not. Most men simply never take the time to check." They rebuilt the barn first, because a barn could shelter both animals and men while the house waited its turn, and because Leanne discovered within her first week on the ranch that Josiah Reed's competence with wood and rope and stubborn animals was matched, almost precisely, by his hopelessness with anything involving numbers, ledgers, or the particular language bankers used to make simple men feel foolish. "You've been paying the feed supplier twice what the Hendricks place pays," she told him one evening, 3 ledgers spread across a crate that served as their table inside the half-finished barn, the only structure with enough of a roof to keep the summer rain off paper. "The invoice from March lists a delivery fee that does not appear in any of the deliveries actually received." "You can read all that from a column of numbers?" "I kept my family's shipping accounts for 4 years before I left Canton," Leanne said. "Numbers do not lie, even when the men writing them intend for them to. Someone has been charging you for freight that was never sent." Josiah leaned over the ledger she pushed toward him, and for a long moment he said nothing, studying figures that had apparently sat in plain view for months without anyone catching what they meant. "That's Corliss's feed operation," he said finally, quiet. "Runs it under his brother-in-law's name so it doesn't look like it's his." "Then he has been stealing from you for longer than 3 years." "Reckon he has." Something hardened in his face, the particular stillness of a man recalculating an enemy he had underestimated. "I'll need proof enough to take before the circuit judge when he comes through in the fall. Not just numbers. Something that shows the pattern clear." "I can build that," Leanne said. "Give me the rest of the ledgers." It took the better part of 6 weeks to gather everything she needed, working in the evenings by lamplight after the day's physical labor was done, cross-checking every invoice against dates she pulled from the freight company's own posted schedules whenever Josiah made trips into town for supplies. She learned the rhythm of the fraud, the way she had once learned the rhythm of her family's shipping ledgers. Learned that Nathaniel Corliss was careful, but not careful enough. That a man confident nobody would ever check his figures grew sloppy in exactly the places a careful eye would find him. "Here," she said one evening, sliding a sheet of her own careful handwriting across the crate toward Josiah. "March, June, and August all charged a delivery fee for freight the shipping company's own records show was never sent. 14 instances across 2 years. $61 in total, which does not sound like much until you understand it is $61 taken from a ranch that could not spare a single one of them." Josiah read the figures twice, his jaw working the way it did whenever anger sat in him without an outlet for it yet. "My father trusted that man's bank with everything he had. Never once thought to question a bill." "Your father was a rancher, not an accountant," Leanne said. "There is no shame in trusting a thief who is careful to seem trustworthy. The shame belongs to the thief." He looked at her across the lamplight, something warmer than gratitude moving behind his eyes. "You didn't have to spend 6 weeks on this." "I did," Leanne said, because a debt built on lies is not a debt at all. It is theft wearing a ledger's clothing, and I do not intend to let it stand simply because no one thought to look closely before now. The barn wall gave way to a hard summer storm 2 weeks later, the same week they had finally raised the first frame of the new house, and it was Leanne who noticed the horses had gone still and silent in the half-repaired stalls, a full quarter hour before the sky actually broke open. The specific stillness that meant animals had smelled a change in the air no human could detect yet. "Something's wrong with them," she said, already moving toward the barn before Josiah had finished pulling his boots on. He caught up to her at the door, and together they worked the horses loose from the stalls just as the first hard gust tore through, carrying with it the particular green smell of a storm that meant more than rain. The wind came in sideways within minutes, and the half-raised frame of the new house groaned under it, timbers straining against nails that had not yet been given time to properly set. "We lose that frame, we're starting from nothing again," Josiah shouted over the wind, already hauling rope toward the corner posts. "Then we do not lose it," Leanne said, and grabbed the other end of the rope without waiting to be asked, bracing her weight against a corner post while Josiah worked the line taut around the base. Her cheongsam, soaked through within seconds, clung and tore at the hem where it caught against splintered wood, but she did not let go, did not step back, held the post steady with her whole body while rain came down hard enough to blur the world past 10 feet in any direction. They held the frame through the worst of it, working in a silence too loud with wind for words to carry, and when the storm finally broke past them toward the eastern ridge, they stood in the mud beside a house frame that had bent but not fallen, both of them soaked and shaking with the particular exhaustion that comes after fighting something larger than yourself and winning. "You could have let go," Josiah said, breathing hard, looking at her like he was seeing something for the first time. "Nobody would have blamed you for letting go." "I did not come here to watch things burn a second time," Leanne said. "Not while I still had hands to stop it." He did not say anything else for a long moment, just looked at her standing in the mud with her ruined dress and her steady hands, and something in his face had changed by the time he finally spoke again. "My wife," he said quietly. "First one. Died of fever 4 years back, before any of this. I stopped expecting anyone to stand in a storm for a piece of land that wasn't theirs yet." "It is not only your land," Leanne said. "Not if I am to live on it." That was the first time either of them said, without quite saying it outright, that this had stopped being an arrangement made by families across an ocean and started being something they were choosing for themselves. One storm and one ledger and one long, silent evening at a time. They finished repairs on the frame the following morning, working side by side without much talk, the kind of quiet that had stopped feeling like the silence between strangers and started feeling like the comfortable quiet of two people who had already said the things that mattered most. Leanne found herself watching the way Josiah worked, the deliberate care he took with every joint and nail, the way he ran his calloused hand along a fresh cut of timber to check for splinters before he let her near it. "You check every board twice," she observed, handing him a length of rope. "Lost my first wife to a fever nobody caught early enough," he said, not looking up from his work. "I've made a habit since then of catching what I can catch before it costs somebody something they can't get back. Boards, ledgers, doesn't much matter. Same principle." "That is not a small thing to admit," Leanne said quietly. "No," he agreed. "Reckon it isn't. Haven't said it to anyone in 4 years." She did not press him further, understanding instinctively that a man like Josiah Reed offered his history the way he offered everything else, in careful, measured amounts, never more than the moment could hold. but she filed the words away all the same, understanding that he had chosen to hand them to her specifically, out of everyone in the territory who might have asked. The private truth came 3 nights later, when Josiah found her sitting outside the barn with the lacquered trunk open in front of her, sorting through the few things she had carried from Canton. "You don't have to explain your things to me," he said, settling onto the step beside her, careful with the distance he kept. "I am not explaining them. I am deciding what to do with them." She lifted a folded length of red silk from the trunk, old and carefully kept, the kind of fabric that had clearly been handled by careful hands for a long time before it ever crossed an ocean. "This was my grandmother's. She kept a small fortune in gold thread sewn into the lining of clothes just like this one, in case she ever needed to leave a place quickly and could not carry coin openly. My mother did the same with mine before I left." Josiah went very still. "How much?" "Enough," Leanne said, "to rebuild a house. Perhaps enough to buy back land if a certain man's debts to the bank prove larger than his patience." She looked at him directly. "I did not tell you before now because I did not know, until the storm, whether this was a place I intended to stay long enough for it to matter. And now I know," she said simply. He did not reach for her hand, not yet, but something in the careful distance between them had closed by the smallest possible margin, close enough that she felt the warmth of him beside her in the cooling night air. "I won't take your family's gold to save my land," he said finally. "Wouldn't be right." "It is not your land I am trying to save," Leanne said. "It is ours, if you will have it be so. And I did not survive 6 weeks at sea to watch a man too proud to accept help lose everything to a thief with a silver watch chain." Something that was almost a laugh broke loose from him, low and surprised. "You've got a sharper tongue than anyone let on before you got here." "Nobody asked me a question worth answering honestly before now," Leanne said. He reached across the crate then, for the first time since the storm, and covered her hand with his, steady and certain in a way that needed no further words to carry its meaning. She did not pull away. "My mother used to say gold sewn into a hymn was worth less than a promise sewn into a life," Leanne said after a long moment, her hand still beneath his. "I did not understand what she meant until I watched you hold that frame steady in the storm instead of saving yourself the trouble." "Your mother sounds like she understood people better than most," Josiah said. "She understood that a man who tells you what he is worth is usually lying, and a man who shows you is usually the one worth trusting." Leanne turned her hand beneath his, palm to palm now. "You have shown me a great deal these past months, Josiah Reed. None of it in words." "Never had much use for words," he admitted. "Figured actions carried further out here anyhow, where a man's word doesn't mean much if his fences don't hold and his cattle don't thrive." "Then let your actions speak for what comes next," Leanne said, "and I will listen carefully." The days that followed carried a different quality than the weeks before them. The particular ease of two people who had stopped circling the question of what they were to each other and simply allowed the answer to settle in around them the way dust settled after a long ride, quiet and complete and entirely undramatic in the way that true things often were. Nathaniel Corliss made his move at the end of summer, when the note on the bank loan Josiah's late father had taken out years earlier came due all at once, called in early under a clause buried in fine print that Josiah had never fully understood, and Corliss had clearly been counting on for exactly this moment. 90 days, Corliss said, standing in what remained of the ranch yard with 2 men flanking him who were paid to look intimidating rather than to say anything useful. "Pay the note in full, or the north section transfers to the bank as collateral. Those are the terms your father signed." "Those aren't the terms," Leanne said, stepping forward with a ledger in her hand before Josiah could answer. "I have spent 3 months reconciling every invoice your feed operation has issued to this ranch since it opened. The overcharges alone, documented with dates and delivery records that do not match your own shipping logs, exceed the amount owed on that note by better than $400. Corliss's easy smile faltered, just slightly, just long enough for Leanne to see the calculation happening behind his eyes. "That's a serious accusation from a woman who's been in this territory less than 4 months. "It is not an accusation," Leanne said. "It is arithmetic. The circuit judge arrives in 11 days. I intend to present these figures to him alongside the note itself, and let him decide whether a man who has been quietly stealing from his neighbor for 3 years has any standing to call in a loan early." The silence that followed stretched long enough for a hawk to cross the whole width of sky above them before Corliss spoke again, and when he did, some of the honeyed pleasantness had gone entirely out of his voice. "You'd ruin a man's reputation over a bookkeeping dispute." "You tried to take a man's land while he was still rebuilding from a fire," Leanne said. "I'm simply making certain the judge understands the whole shape of the story, not only the part that favors you." Josiah stepped up beside her then, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and something in his stance had shifted from a man defending his land alone to a man standing beside someone who had chosen to defend it with him. "You heard the lady, Nathaniel. 90 days. We'll see you and the judge both in 11. Corliss looked between the two of them for a long moment, weighing something Leanne could not fully read, then turned without another word and walked back toward his waiting horse, his 2 hired men trailing behind him with considerably less confidence than they had arrived with. The 11 days that followed moved slower than the whole summer that preceded them. Leanne spent every evening rechecking the figures, cross-referencing dates against the freight company's own public shipping schedule, building a case so complete that even a judge inclined to favor the wealthiest man in the county would find it difficult to dismiss. Josiah spent his days finishing the frame of the house, and his nights, more often than not, sitting across from her at the crate that had become their table, watching her work with an expression he no longer bothered to hide. "You didn't have to fight this for me," he said one of those nights, quiet, the lamp between them burning low. "I did not fight it for you," Leanne said, not looking up from the ledger. "I fought it for us. There is a difference, though I understand you may not have had reason to notice it before now." The circuit judge arrived in Prairie Bend on a hot morning in late August, and the hearing that followed lasted less than 2 hours, because the ledgers Leanne had built left almost nothing for either lawyer to argue about. Nathaniel Corliss's own shipping records, subpoenaed from the freight company itself, matched Leanne's figures nearly to the dollar, and the judge's patience for a man who had spent 3 years quietly overcharging his neighbor evaporated somewhere around the 40th documented instance. "The note is satisfied," the judge said, setting down the final page of Leanne's careful accounting. "In fact, Mr. Corliss, by my calculation you owe Mr. Reed a considerable sum in restitution, which this court will expect settled before winter. As for the collateral clause, I find it unenforceable given the fraudulent basis of the charges that led to it." Otis Bramwell was among those gathered in the courthouse that morning, and he found Leanne on the steps afterward, hat in hand, something like wonder still fresh on his weathered face. 40 acres I lost to that man 2 winters back," he said. "Never thought I'd see the day someone made him answer for how he does business." "You should petition the judge yourself before he leaves the territory," Leanne said. "I would be glad to help you organize the records if you have kept any of your correspondence with the bank." "Ma'am, I don't rightly know how to thank you for that offer." "Thank me by keeping better ledgers from now on," Leanne said, and something in Otis Bramwell's face cracked into the first real laugh he had allowed himself in 2 winters. Corliss did not look at either of them on his way out of the courthouse. He did not need to. The whole town had gathered to watch, and the whole town understood exactly what had happened. Understood, too, that the story would travel faster through Prairie Bend than any telegraph line could carry it. The restitution money arrived from the bank in October, delivered by a clerk who could not quite meet Josiah's eyes as he counted the coin into his hands. And within a week the sound of hammers had replaced the sound of wind through broken timber for the first time since the fire. Leanne oversaw much of the rebuilding herself, insisting on details Josiah admitted he never would have thought to ask for. A proper root cellar dug deep enough to keep vegetables through the harshest winter. A second well positioned closer to the new barn so no one would need to carry water so far in bad weather again. "You think of things I don't," Josiah told her one afternoon, watching her direct the placement of a support beam with the same quiet authority she had once used to detail every discrepancy in Corliss's ledgers. "I think of what happens when things go wrong," Leanne said. "You think of what happens when things go right. Between the two of us, I believe we account for most possibilities." 3 months later, the new house stood finished on the same foundation where the old one had burned, wider now, with a second story Josiah had insisted on adding once the restitution money came through, and a porch that faced west toward pasture land thick with cattle bought back at fair prices from ranchers who had once assumed the Reed operation was finished for good. Leanne stood on that porch in the cool of an early autumn evening, wearing a length of the same gray silk her grandmother had once sewn gold thread into, remade now into something new, and watched Josiah walk up from the barn with the particular unhurried gait of a man who had finally stopped waiting for the next disaster to arrive. "Corliss sold his feed operation," he said, climbing the porch steps. "Word is he's leaving the territory before the note comes due in full." "Good," Leanne said. "A man who builds his fortune on other men's ignorance rarely survives long once the ignorance is gone." Josiah settled beside her at the rail, close enough now that the distance between them had become simply the distance between 2 people who no longer needed to measure it. 400 head back on the land, house standing, debt cleared. He looked at her sideways. "None of that happens if you'd turned that wagon around the day you arrived." "None of it happens if you had asked me to," Leanne said. "You did not. That is why I stayed." He was quiet for a moment, watching the cattle move slow and easy across the pasture below them, healthy and numerous in a way that would have seemed impossible standing in the ash 3 months earlier. "I never did ask you outright," he said finally, "whether you meant to stay for good, past what your family arranged. Figured I'd let you decide in your own time." "You have been letting me decide everything in my own time since the day I arrived," Leanne said. "It is, I think, the reason I decided at all." The last light of evening settled gold over the pasture, catching on the new roof line the way it had once caught on nothing but broken timber and ash, and Leanne understood, standing there in silk remade from her grandmother's careful hands, that she had crossed an ocean expecting an arranged life, and found instead one she had built herself, plank by plank, ledger by ledger, choice by choice. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.